What if I told you that your government once poisoned 10,000 of its own people on purpose? That they sprayed entire cities with germs just to see what would happen? That they gave random Americans a drug called LSD in a secret place while government workers watched through special mirrors? You probably think I'm talking about a made-up story, right? Maybe something your uncle shares on the internet at 2 in the morning. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every single thing you're about to hear is real, written down in official papers, and can be proven. These aren't just theories. They're facts that were hidden in secret files until brave people who told the truth, court cases, or special government investigations brought them out into the open. So before we begin, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like because YouTube's computer system doesn't love dark history. And I need your help making sure these stories actually reach people. Now get comfortable, turn down the lights, and get ready to learn 100 things your government did that they really hoped you'd never find out about. Let's start in 1932 in a place called Macon County, Alabama. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. It's 1932. The Great Depression is hurting America badly. And in Macon County, Alabama, the U.S. Public Health Service goes to nearly 400 black men. They tell them they're getting free health care for bad blood. Sounds generous, right? Except here's the thing. These men had syphilis, a serious disease, and the government knew it. For 40 years, doctors watched these men suffer. They wrote down notes about what happened to untreated syphilis as it destroyed their bodies, their minds, their lives. Even after a medicine called penicillin became the normal cure in 1947, they didn't give it to them. They didn't tell the men what they actually had. They just watched like you'd watch mold grow on bread in a science fair project, except the bread was human beings with families. 28 men died directly from syphilis. 100 more died from problems caused by it. Their wives caught it. Their children were born with it. The study didn't end until 1972 when someone who knew the truth leaked it to newspapers. But of course, breaking medical rules was just getting started. MKUltra. And speaking of experiments people didn't agree to, let's talk about the Central Intelligence Agency and their relationship with a drug called lysergic acid diethylamide, or as your cool uncle calls it, LSD. From 1953 to 1973, the CIA ran a program called MKUltra. The goal? Mind control. The method? Giving drugs to thousands of Americans without their knowledge or permission. We're talking prisoners, mental patients, random people at bars. The CIA actually paid for a secret apartment operation in San Francisco where they gave people LSD and watched them through one-way mirrors. For science. They gave it to soldiers, to hospital patients, to college students who thought they were joining in normal studies. One CIA officer even put LSD in his coworker's coffee. That guy later died by jumping through a window. Oops. The craziest part? We only know about this because someone forgot to destroy the files. Most of the records were destroyed on purpose in 1973. So if you've ever felt worried about being watched, just remember, sometimes the worry is correct. Operation Northwoods. Speaking of correct worries, military leaders have actually suggested staging fake terrorist attacks. It's 1962. Cuba is right there, just 90 miles from Florida. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff are getting creative. By creative, I mean they all approved a plan to stage fake terrorist attacks on American soil to make people want to invade Cuba. The plan included hijacking planes, bombing U.S. cities, sinking boats full of Cuban refugees, and blaming it all on Castro. They wanted to create what they called a helpful wave of national anger. Their words, not mine. They even suggested painting a plane to look like a passenger aircraft, filling it with fake passengers and shooting it down. Just normal Pentagon stuff. President Kennedy read the plan. Then he said no firmly. The kind of no that ends careers. The operation never happened. But the document sat in a locked vault until it became public in 1997. You can read it yourself. It's real. COINTELPRO. Now, if you think that's the only time the government got creative with watching and disrupting people, buckle up because the FBI had a whole program for that. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI ran a program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Their mission? Watching, sneaking into, embarrassing, and disrupting American citizens who had opinions the government didn't like. Civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, the Black Panthers, even Albert Einstein had a file. But the FBI's special project was Martin Luther King Jr. They put listening devices in his home, his hotel rooms, his phones. They recorded his private conversations looking for anything to destroy his reputation. Then they sent him a letter, an anonymous letter suggesting he kill himself before accepting the Nobel Peace Prize. They included audio recordings from their spying, hinting they'd release them if he didn't do it. This wasn't just one bad agent. This was official policy. J. Edgar Hoover personally approved operations to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize activists. They didn't just watch people. They actively tried to destroy their lives, relationships, and organizations. Poisoned alcohol during Prohibition. But watching wasn't the only creative solution the government found to problems. Sometimes they just added poison to things people were already drinking. Let's rewind to the 1920s. Prohibition is happening and Americans are still drinking because of course they are. The government's frustrated. So they decide to try a new trick, poisoning the alcohol supply. Industrial alcohol was regularly stolen and turned into bootleg liquor. The government knew this, so they ordered factories to add even more toxic chemicals, things like methanol, gasoline, benzene, and acetone. The idea was to make people too sick to drink. The reality? They made people dead. By the end of Prohibition in 1933, about 10,000 Americans had died from government-poisoned alcohol. On Christmas Eve 1926 alone, 60 people died in New York City from toxic booze. The government kept doing it anyway. Medical examiners called it murder. The government called it a warning. Either way, people kept drinking and kept dying because apparently the best way to handle a public health problem is to add more poison. Radiation experiments on pregnant women. And speaking of adding things to people without asking, let's talk about what they did to pregnant women. It's the 1940s and 1950s and scientists are very curious about radiation. So curious, in fact, that they decide to feed radioactive iron to hundreds of pregnant women at Vanderbilt University and other places. The women were told they were getting vitamin pills to help their babies. They were not told that these vitamins were radioactive. The goal was to study how radiation moved through the body and into the unborn baby. For science. And by science, I mean we want to know what happens during nuclear fallout, so let's use pregnant women as test subjects. The study tracked these women and their children for years. Some of the children got cancer. The government didn't tell the families about the radiation. Until decades later. When the story finally broke in the 1990s, money was paid. Apologies were given. The usual. Operation Sea Spray. But hey, at least those experiments were done in hospitals. Sometimes the government preferred to do their testing out in the open air where everyone could participate without knowing. September 1950. The U.S. Navy has a question. What would happen if someone released biological weapons over an American city? And instead of, running a fake test, they decide to just do it for real over San Francisco. For 6 days, Navy ships sprayed clouds of bacteria, Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, over the city. The military thought these bacteria were harmless. The wind carried them over 2 miles inland. The bacteria settled on buildings, on streets, in people's lungs. Shortly after, hospital visits for pneumonia and urinary tract infections went up. One man, Edward Nevin, died from a Serratia infection. His grandson later sued the government. The government's defense? We didn't think it would hurt anyone. They lost anyway. This wasn't the only biological test. Between 1949 and 1969, the military did hundreds of secret biological warfare tests on American cities. Project Sunshine. But at least they were testing on living people. Sometimes they preferred to use the dead, specifically babies. Let me tell you about Project Sunshine, which is quite possibly the most unfortunately named government program in history. In the 1950s, scientists wanted to measure strontium-90 levels from nuclear fallout. Strontium-90 builds up in bones, especially young bones. So they needed samples, lots of samples. The solution? They secretly collected body parts from dead babies and children around the world. Over 1,500 samples. They didn't ask their parents for permission. They just took pieces during autopsies. legs, ribs, entire spines. Then they shipped them back to the United States for testing. Parents had no idea their children's bodies had been harvested. Some remains were taken from countries like Australia, South America, and Europe. When the program was exposed in the 1990s, governments said they were sorry. The families? They got to live with the knowledge that their babies' bodies had been mined for Cold War data. The business plot. But body snatching wasn't the government's only creative strategy. Sometimes wealthy Americans tried to skip the middleman entirely and just overthrow democracy themselves. 1933. The Great Depression is destroying America, and President Franklin Roosevelt is passing New Deal policies left and right. This makes wealthy business owners very nervous. So nervous, apparently, that a group of them, backed by some of Wall Street's biggest names, allegedly decided to overthrow the government. They approached Major General Smedley Butler, a decorated Marine, thinking he'd lead a fascist takeover. Instead, Butler went straight to Congress and testified under oath about the plot. He named names. He detailed plans to install a dictator and create a military force of 500,000 veterans. Congress held hearings. They confirmed a plot existed. Then nothing. No arrests, no prosecutions. The names were hidden from the public record. Some of the alleged plotters included people connected to DuPont, Goodyear, and even Prescott Bush's banking partners. Butler spent the rest of his life warning about war, profiteering, and corporate power. Operation Paperclip. Meanwhile, speaking of powerful people getting second chances, the U.S. had a whole operation for that after World War II. World War II ends. The Nazis lose. Justice is served, right? Well, mostly. Except the United States secretly hired over 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians and brought them to America. They gave them new identities, new jobs, and very few questions about what they did during the war. This was Operation Paperclip, named after the paper clips used to attach new files to their folders. The recruits included Wernher von Braun, who built Hitler's V-2 rockets using slave labor. He became the father of NASA's space program. Arthur Rudolph, who ran the Middlework factory where 20,000 prisoners died, helped design the Saturn V rocket. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency actively cleaned up Nazi records, deleting references to war crimes and SS memberships. Their reason? We needed them before the Soviets got them. Because apparently the Cold War required a few genocides to be overlooked. These scientists went on to have distinguished American careers. Iran-Contra affair. And if you're thinking the government never made morally questionable deals again, well, let me tell you about the 1980s. Picture this. It's the 1980s. The United States publicly calls Iran a terrorist state. We have a weapons ban against them. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the Reagan administration is secretly selling them weapons. Lots of weapons. Why? To fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, which Congress had specifically forbidden. So the administration sold missiles to Iran, raised the prices, and sent the profits to right-wing death squads in Central America. When a plane carrying weapons was shot down and the operation exposed, they called it a mistake in judgment. Oliver North shredded documents. Reagan said he didn't remember. 14 people were charged, 11 were convicted. Most convictions were later overturned or pardoned by George H.W. Bush. The whole affair revealed a shadow foreign policy running parallel to official government positions. Gulf of Tonkin incident. But illegal weapons deals weren't the only creative financing happening. Sometimes the reason for war itself turned out to be, let's say, flexible with the truth. August 1964. The USS Maddox is in the Gulf of Tonkin. They report being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, they reported a second attack. President Johnson uses these attacks to push through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving him broad war powers in Vietnam. Here's the thing about that second attack. It never happened. The commander of the Maddox sent a follow-up message saying, freak weather effects and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports, but that cable was conveniently not shared with Congress. Johnson himself later admitted, for all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there. In 2005, declassified NSA documents confirmed it. The second attack was a mistake. Bad sonar readings, jumpy sailors, no actual enemy. But it gave the U.S. the reason to escalate a war that would kill 58,000 Americans and over 2 million Vietnamese. CIA cocaine trafficking. And speaking of operations that happened while everyone was looking the other way, let's talk about what the CIA was doing in Los Angeles. In 1996, journalist Gary Webb published a series called Dark Alliance in the San Jose Mercury News. His investigation claimed that the CIA-backed Contras in Nicaragua helped smuggle cocaine into Los Angeles during the 1980s, fueling the crack epidemic. The CIA and major news outlets immediately attacked Webb, discrediting him and his reporting. He lost his job. His career was destroyed. Except here's the thing, he was mostly right. In 1998, the CIA's own Inspector General released a report confirming that CIA assets were involved in drug trafficking. The agency had looked the other way while Contra supporters brought cocaine into the United States. They valued funding the Contras over stopping drug smuggling. Gary Webb died in 2004 from 2 gunshot wounds to the head. It was ruled a suicide. His reputation wasn't restored until years later after his death, when other journalists revisited his work and confirmed it was accurate. Guatemala syphilis experiments. But domestic drug problems weren't the only place where government ethics took a vacation. Sometimes they exported those ethics to other countries. Remember the Tuskegee study? The one where the U.S. government watched syphilis destroy black men for 40 years? Turns out they also had an international version. From 1946 to 1948, U.S. Public Health Service doctors deliberately infected nearly 700 Guatemalans with syphilis and gonorrhea without their consent. The subjects included prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and sex workers. Some were infected through intentional exposure to infected prostitutes. Others were directly injected. At least 83 people died. The experiments were designed to test whether penicillin could prevent infection. The results were published in medical journals, but the methods were kept secret for over 60 years. In 2010, the story broke. President Obama officially apologized to Guatemala. Lawsuits were filed. The U.S. government settled but admitted no legal responsibility. Just another day in the long history of medical experiments without consent. FBI's suicide letter to Martin Luther King Jr. And speaking of things done without consent, sometimes the government's harassment went beyond physical experiments into psychological warfare. We touched on COINTELPRO earlier, but this particular moment deserves its own spotlight. In 1964, shortly before Martin Luther King Jr. was set to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI sent him a letter. It was typed anonymously, called him a fraud and a hypocrite. It referenced FBI surveillance recordings of his private life. And then it strongly suggested, though not in clear words, that he should kill himself. "You are done," it said. "There is but one way out for you." The letter came with a package containing audio recordings from FBI wiretaps. The message was clear. End your life or we'll destroy your reputation and legacy. The king didn't do it, obviously. He accepted the Nobel Prize. He continued his work. The FBI continued their campaign. J. Edgar Hoover called him the most notorious liar in the country. The letter was revealed years later and is now in the National Archives. You can read it yourself. It's exactly as chilling as you'd imagine. And with that comforting thought, we're 15 facts into this journey. Your eyelids are getting heavier. The government has gotten weirder. And we've got 85 more facts to go. Chemical weapons testing on American cities. But the FBI's psychological warfare was practically gentle compared to what the military was doing to entire cities. From the 1950s through the 1960s, the U.S. Army did hundreds of secret chemical tests on American populations. They sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide, a potentially cancer-causing compound, over Minneapolis, St. Louis, and Winnipeg. They released it from planes, from rooftops, from moving vehicles. The clouds drifted over schools, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods. The Army claimed it was harmless tracer material to study how chemical agents would spread during a Soviet attack. They didn't bother mentioning the tests were happening. Decades later, when the program was exposed, some studies suggested the compound could cause lung damage and cancer. The Army said it was safe. They would know, after all, they had tested it on millions of people without asking. The tests were part of a larger program involving more than 200 cities. Edgewood Arsenal experiments. But if you think spraying chemicals over cities from a distance was concerning, wait until you hear what they did to soldiers up close. From 1955 to 1975, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps ran experiments at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Over 7,000 soldiers were exposed to chemical and biological agents. Not in combat, in labs on purpose. The Army gave them LSD, PCP, BZ, a drug so powerful it could make people unable to function for days. They exposed them to sarin and VX nerve agents, mustard gas. Soldiers were told they were testing equipment or uniforms. Many had no idea they were being used as human test subjects for weapons. The effects lasted for years. Some soldiers got cancer. Others suffered psychological trauma, chronic illness, memory loss. When they tried to get treatment from the VA, their military records had been classified. They couldn't prove what had been done to them. In 2004, the Army finally acknowledged the program. By 2009, Congress passed a law requiring the Pentagon to identify and notify all test subjects. Thousands of men spent decades not knowing why they were sick. The secret war in Laos. And if you think the military saved its worst weapons testing for enemy territory, well, they definitely did plenty there too. Let me tell you about a war most Americans don't even know happened. From 1964 to 1973, the United States dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on Laos. That's more than all the bombs dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. One plane load every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years straight. Why? Laos was officially neutral during the Vietnam War, but the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through it. So the U.S. carpet-bombed the country in secret. Congress didn't know the full extent. The American public definitely didn't. 30% of those bombs didn't explode. They're still there. 80 million unexploded cluster bombs scattered across the countryside. Since the war ended, over 20,000 Laotians have been killed or injured by leftover American ordnance. Mostly farmers, mostly children. Laos is the most heavily bombed country per capita in history, and it was technically a secret. Operation Midnight Climax. Speaking of secret operations involving impaired judgment and poor decisions, the CIA had a whole program for that. Remember MKUltra? The CIA's mind control program? Well, they had a special sub-project that was exactly as weird as it sounds. Operation Midnight Climax, which ran from 1954 to 1963, involved CIA agents paying prostitutes to bring unsuspecting men to safe houses in San Francisco and New York. Once inside, the men were drugged with LSD without their knowledge. CIA agents watched through two-way mirrors while the men had sex with the prostitutes, all while under the influence of powerful drugs. The apartments were decorated to look like brothels, complete with photographs of women in bondage positions on the walls. The stated goal was to study whether LSD could be used for mind control and to gather blackmail material on Soviet spies. The actual result was a lot of confused men having very bad trips while federal agents took notes. When the program was exposed in the 1970s, most of the records had been destroyed. The men who were drugged, never identified, never compensated, never told what happened to them. No compensation for Tuskegee families. And speaking of people who were never compensated, remember those 400 men in the Tuskegee study, the ones who were denied treatment for syphilis for 40 years? In 1974, the government settled a class action lawsuit. Survivors received $37,000 each. The families of the men who died got $15,000. But here's what didn't happen. No compensation for the wives who caught syphilis from their infected husbands. No compensation for the children born with congenital syphilis. No compensation for the grandchildren who grew up without grandfathers or for the decades of compounded poverty and trauma. The study infected wives and children through deliberate medical neglect. Those secondary victims, the women who trusted their husbands, the babies born with disabilities, received nothing. The settlement specifically excluded them. In 1997, President Clinton formally apologized. He called it shameful, but apologies don't pay medical bills or bring back the dead. The CIA destroyed MKUltra records. And speaking of things that can't be undone, Sometimes the evidence gets destroyed before anyone can be held accountable. In 1973, as Watergate was exposing government misconduct left and right, CIA Director Richard Helms had a problem. MKUltra, the CIA's illegal mind control program, was about to be investigated. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. Thousands of documents were shredded. An estimated 90% of the program's files vanished. Everything from detailed experiment notes to financial records to the names of test subjects gone. What we know about MKUltra comes from the 10% that survived, mostly financial documents that had been misfiled and escaped destruction. This means we'll never know the full extent of the program. How many people were dosed? How many died? What were the actual results? The CIA successfully erased the evidence of one of the most extensive domestic human rights violations in American history. Helms was later convicted of lying to Congress about Chile. He received a fine and a suspended sentence. No one went to prison for MKUltra. Forced sterilization programs. And speaking of violations that went on for far too long, between 1907 and the 1970s, over 60,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws. The targets? Poor people, disabled people, people of color, people considered feeble-minded or unfit to reproduce. Women were sterilized without consent during other medical procedures. Sometimes they were told they were having appendectomies. California led the nation with 20,000 forced sterilizations, but 32 states had eugenics laws. In Virginia, Carrie Buck was sterilized in 1927 after being raped, because authorities decided her pregnancy proved she was morally bad. The Supreme Court upheld Virginia's sterilization law 8-1. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The programs continued well into the 1970s. In some states, prisoners were offered reduced sentences in exchange for sterilization. Native American women were sterilized by Indian Health Service doctors without proper consent through the 1970s. The last forced sterilization law wasn't removed until 2013. Mustard gas tests segregated by race. And if you think the eugenics mindset stayed in the courtroom, the military had their own twisted version. During World War II, the U.S. military tested mustard gas and other chemical agents on approximately 60,000 American soldiers. These weren't accidental exposure tests. These were deliberate experiments to measure the effects of chemical weapons on human subjects. Here's where it gets worse: the tests were segregated by race. The military specifically wanted to see if Black and Puerto Rican soldiers would react differently to chemical weapons than white soldiers. They exposed these men to mustard gas that caused painful blisters, breathing problems, and long-term health issues. The men were sworn to secrecy. Their medical records were classified. When they developed cancer and other illnesses decades later, they couldn't prove their military service had caused it, so they couldn't get VA benefits. The full extent of the program wasn't revealed until 2015 when NPR and the Department of Veterans Affairs finally investigated. Many of the test subjects had already died. Those still alive were in their 90s, still fighting for recognition and compensation. The FBI labeled Mandela a terrorist. And speaking of people the government refused to recognize properly, let's talk about someone who became one of the most celebrated heroes of the 20th century. Nelson Mandela, Nobel Peace Prize winner, international symbol of reconciliation and justice, celebrated statesman who helped end apartheid. Also, according to the United States government, a terrorist. From the 1980s until 2008, Nelson Mandela was on the U.S. terrorism watch list. This meant that technically every time he visited the United States, including to address the United Nations, he needed a special waiver because he was classified as a terrorist threat. The listing dated back to when Mandela's organization, the African National Congress, was fighting apartheid in South Africa. The U.S. supported the apartheid government, so anti-apartheid activists were labeled terrorists. Even after Mandela was released from prison, became president of South Africa, won the Nobel Prize, and became globally celebrated, the U.S. didn't remove him from the list. Congress finally passed a bill in 2008, when Mandela was 90 years old, to remove him and other ANC members from the watch list. Better late than never, I suppose. The Reagan administration ignored AIDS. And speaking of delayed responses to humanitarian crises, let's talk about the 1980s. In 1981, the first cases of a mysterious illness appeared among gay men in Los Angeles and New York. By 1982, it had a name: Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS. By 1985, over 12,000 Americans had died. During those years, President Reagan didn't publicly mention AIDS, not once. His press secretary, Larry Speakes, laughed about it during press briefings. When reporters asked about the gay plague, Speakes made jokes. The press corps laughed along. You can listen to the recordings. They're as horrifying as you'd imagine. The Reagan administration opposed funding for AIDS research, blocked education campaigns, and refused to treat it as a public health emergency. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop wanted to mail AIDS information to every household in America. The White House blocked it for years. Reagan finally said the word AIDS publicly in 1987, after more than 20,000 Americans had died. By then, the disease had spread globally. The delayed response allowed the epidemic to spiral out of control. Death squads in El Salvador. But while the administration ignored suffering at home, they were quite active in supporting violence abroad. Throughout the 1980s, the United States provided military training, weapons, and over $1 billion to El Salvador's government during their civil war. That government ran death squads that murdered tens of thousands of civilians. In December 1980, for American church women, 3 nuns and a lay missionary were raped and murdered by El Salvador's National Guard. The women had been doing humanitarian work with refugees. 5 guardsmen eventually confessed. They said they had acted on orders from higher-ups. The Reagan administration initially blamed the victims. Secretary of State Alexander Haig suggested the women might have run a roadblock. UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick said they weren't just nuns, but political activists. The U.S. continued funding El Salvador's military. Over the next decade, El Salvador's death squads killed an estimated 75,000 people. The U.S. trained many of these soldiers at the School of the Americas. We knew what they were doing. We kept sending money anyway. CIA coups of democratically elected leaders. And El Salvador wasn't an isolated case. The U.S. had a habit of overthrowing governments that disagreed with. Let's take a quick tour of the CIA's greatest hits in overthrowing democracy. Iran, 1953. The CIA organized a coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized oil. They installed the Shah, whose brutal regime lasted until the Iranian Revolution. That revolution was directly caused by resentment over the U.S.-backed coup. Guatemala, 1954. The CIA overthrew democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz because he tried land reform that threatened United Fruit Company. The coup led to a 40-year civil war that killed 200,000 Guatemalans. Congo, 1960. The CIA plotted to kill Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. He was assassinated within months of taking office. The country descended into decades of dictatorship. Chile, 1973. The CIA backed a military coup against Salvador Allende. Thousands were killed under Pinochet's dictatorship. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are declassified operations. The U.S. systematically undermined democracies, installed dictators, and caused decades of suffering because we disagreed with their economic policies. Cluster bombs on Cambodia. And speaking of long-term suffering caused by American bombs, while we were secretly bombing Laos, we were also secretly bombing Cambodia. From 1969 to 1973, the U.S. dropped over 2.7 million tons of bombs on Cambodia. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger ordered the bombing campaign without telling Congress. The targets were supposed to be North Vietnamese supply routes. The reality was carpet bombing that killed between 150,000 and 500,000 Cambodian civilians. The bombing destabilized the country and helped the Khmer Rouge rise to power. Yes, the genocidal regime that killed 2 million people, American bombs helped create the conditions for that. And just like in Laos, many of the bombs didn't explode. Cambodia is still littered with unexploded ordnance. Since 1979, more than 64,000 Cambodians have been killed or injured by leftover American cluster bombs, farmers plowing fields, children finding strange metal objects. We destroyed a neutral country, helped trigger a genocide, and left behind a landscape of bombs that will keep killing people for generations. Fake vaccination programs in Pakistan. And speaking of American actions that keep causing harm decades later, let's talk about a CIA operation in Pakistan. In 2011, the CIA was hunting for Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. They had a clever idea. Run a fake hepatitis vaccination program to collect DNA samples from children in the compound where they suspected bin Laden was hiding. If they found DNA matching bin Laden's family, they'd know they had the right place. So they recruited a Pakistani doctor, Shakil Afridi, and sent teams door-to-door offering free vaccines. Some of the vaccines were real, some weren't. The program was cut short when bin Laden was killed in the raid, but the damage was done. When the operation was exposed, trust in vaccination programs collapsed across Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan. Polio vaccination workers were murdered by Taliban militants who believed they were American spies. Pakistan became one of the last countries where polio remained endemic. The CIA's fake vaccination program directly contributed to vaccine hesitancy that has killed and paralyzed thousands of children. Health organizations around the world condemned the operation. The damage to public health continues today. Lost nuclear weapons. But at least those were intentional operations. Sometimes the government just loses track of incredibly dangerous things. Here's a fun fact to help you sleep. The United States has lost at least 6 nuclear weapons and never found them. These are officially called broken arrows, nuclear weapons accidents. The military admits to 32 broken arrow incidents, but at least 6 involved weapons that were never recovered. One is somewhere off the coast of Tybee Island, Georgia. A B-47 bomber collided with a fighter jet in 1958 and dropped a 7,000-pound Mark 15 nuclear bomb into the ocean. Still there, probably. Another is in the waters off Palomares, Spain, where a B-52 crashed in 1966. They recovered 3 of the 4 nukes it was carrying. The 4th is at the bottom of the Mediterranean. There's one in Wassaw Sound near Savannah, lost in 1958. One near Greenland from a 1968 crash. The military says the lost weapons pose minimal radiation risk. They also said Agent Orange was safe and that atomic bomb tests wouldn't hurt anyone, so make of that what you will. FBI surveillance of John Lennon. And speaking of the government keeping tabs on things they probably shouldn't, let's talk about their obsession with a Beatle. In 1972, John Lennon moved to New York City. He was openly opposed to the Vietnam War. This made President Nixon and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover very nervous, especially since Lennon had a platform and Nixon had an election coming up. So the FBI opened a file on Lennon. They tracked his movements. They attended his concerts. They monitored his phone calls. They compiled a 300-page dossier on a musician whose greatest crime was writing Imagine. The FBI also worked with the Immigration and Naturalization Service to try to deport Lennon for a 1968 marijuana conviction in Britain. The goal was to silence him before the election. Lennon fought the deportation for years while under constant surveillance. The campaign only ended when Nixon resigned. Lennon was finally granted permanent residency in 1976. His FBI file was partially released in 1997. Portions remain classified to this day, which raises questions about what exactly the FBI was doing beyond surveillance. Fake Cuban exile groups. And speaking of fabricated operations designed to manipulate public opinion, the CIA had a creative approach during the Cold War. After the Bay of Pigs disaster in 1961, the CIA still really wanted to overthrow Castro. So they created fake Cuban exile organizations to make it look like there was massive organic support for invasion. The CIA funded these groups, wrote their press releases, staged their protests, and generated media coverage. They created the illusion of a genuine grassroots movement demanding U.S. intervention. Some groups were entirely fabricated. Others were real organizations that the CIA infiltrated and controlled. This was part of Operation Mongoose, a covert program to destabilize Cuba through sabotage, propaganda, and assassination attempts. The fake exile groups helped build public and congressional support for continued anti-Castro operations. The Church Committee investigations in the 1970s exposed how extensively the CIA had manipulated public opinion through front groups and media operations. By then, these tactics had been used not just for Cuba but for operations around the world. Biological agents tested on subway systems. And if you think the CIA only manipulated perceptions abroad, they were also quite busy testing things on American soil in very public places. In the 1960s, the U.S. Army wanted to know how biological weapons would spread in a major city. So they decided to test it on the New York City subway system, while it was full of people. In 1966, Army scientists released Bacillus subtilis, a bacteria they claimed was harmless, into the subway through ventilation grills. They tracked how it spread through the tunnels and stations. Over 1 million New Yorkers were potentially exposed during the week-long test. Similar tests were conducted in the Washington, D.C. metro, at Washington National Airport, and on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. The military's logic was that these bacteria were simulants, harmless stand-ins for actual bioweapons. But Bacillus subtilis can cause infections in people with weakened immune systems. No one asked those million subway riders for consent. The tests weren't revealed until the 1977 Church Committee hearings. By then, the Army had conducted hundreds of similar tests across the country. NSA surveillance before Snowden. And speaking of secret surveillance programs revealed years too late, in 2013, Edward Snowden leaked classified NSA documents revealing massive illegal surveillance of American citizens. The media treated it like a shocking revelation. Except the NSA had been doing it for decades. In the 1970s, the Church Committee discovered that the NSA had been illegally intercepting Americans' communications since the 1940s through programs like Project Shamrock and Minaret. The NSA read millions of telegrams and monitored phone calls without warrants. After the revelations, Congress passed laws to prevent warrantless surveillance. The NSA pinky promised to follow them. Then, immediately after September 11th, they started doing it again. The Bush administration authorized warrantless wiretapping. The NSA collected phone records of millions of Americans. The FISA court rubber-stamped surveillance requests in secret. When Snowden exposed this in 2013, the government's defense was basically, yeah, but terrorism. The surveillance programs had been illegal for years. Some were modified, some continued. Mass surveillance of Americans is now just part of the infrastructure. Training Indonesian death squads. And speaking of infrastructure the U.S. built abroad, sometimes we train people in techniques that became nightmares. In 1965, Indonesia's military launched a purge of suspected communists. Over the next year, between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed. Bodies filled rivers. Villages were massacred. It was one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century. The U.S. knew exactly what was happening. We provided the Indonesian military with lists of suspected communists, thousands of names. We supplied communications equipment. We offered covert assistance. CIA and State Department cables from the time show officials were well aware of the massacres and considered them a favorable development. American officials later called it one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century but also described it as a positive outcome for U.S. interests. The Indonesian military had been trained by the U.S. Some of the commanders had attended programs at Fort Leavenworth. The U.S. maintained close relations with Suharto's dictatorship for decades afterward. We only acknowledged our role in 2017 when declassified documents made it undeniable. No apologies were issued, no accountability taken. Radioactive cereal for disabled children. And speaking of experiments where accountability came far too late, in the 1940s and 1950s, researchers at MIT and Harvard fed radioactive iron and calcium to mentally disabled children at the Walter E. Fernald State School in Massachusetts. The children were told they were joining a special science club and would get extra food and field trips. What they actually got was breakfast cereal, milk, and oatmeal laced with radioactive isotopes. The goal was to study how the body absorbed minerals. The children were used as test subjects because they were in an institution and powerless. The experiments were funded by the National Institutes of Health and Quaker Oats, which wanted data on nutrition absorption. Parents were sent consent forms that mentioned dietary research but never mentioned radiation. Most parents signed because they were told their children would receive special attention and treats. The experiments continued for years. The children never knew they'd been used as test subjects. When the studies were revealed in the 1990s, lawsuits were filed. The state and MIT settled, paying $60,000 to each surviving subject. CIA funded abstract expressionism. But sometimes government manipulation wasn't about science. Sometimes it was about culture. During the Cold War, the CIA secretly promoted American abstract expressionism as a weapon against Soviet communism. They funneled money through front organizations to fund exhibitions, museums, and artist tours worldwide. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, secretly funded by the CIA, organized traveling exhibitions of Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko. The goal was to showcase American cultural freedom and sophistication against Soviet socialist realism. Abstract art became propaganda, proof that America was more creative and free than the USSR. Many of the artists had no idea their work was being used this way. Some were political leftists who would have been horrified to know the CIA was promoting them. The museums and galleries often didn't know their funding came from intelligence agencies. The operation was revealed in 1967 when Ramparts magazine exposed the CIA's funding of cultural organizations. By then, abstract expressionism had become globally dominant. The CIA had successfully weaponized art, supporting apartheid South Africa. And speaking of Cold War alliances that aged poorly, the U.S. supported one of the most notorious racist regimes of the 20th century. Throughout the Cold War, the United States maintained close ties with apartheid South Africa. We vetoed UN Security Council resolutions condemning apartheid. We opposed sanctions. We classified Nelson Mandela's ANC as a terrorist organization while maintaining friendly relations with the white supremacist government. President Reagan vetoed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986. Congress overrode his veto, one of the few times that happened during his presidency. Reagan argued that sanctions would hurt black South Africans. What actually hurt black South Africans was the apartheid regime we kept supporting. The U.S. justified its support through Cold War logic. South Africa was anti-communist, so we overlooked the systemic racism, violence, and oppression. We provided military cooperation and intelligence sharing. American companies did business there despite international pressure. Only in the 1990s, as apartheid collapsed, did the U.S. pivot to supporting democracy in South Africa. We showed up late to the right side of history after decades of supporting the wrong one. Government lies about Agent Orange. And speaking of showing up late with apologies for harm caused, let's talk about a chemical weapon we sprayed all over Vietnam. From 1961 to 1971, the U.S. military sprayed nearly 20 million gallons of Agent Orange and other herbicides over Vietnam. The goal was to remove leaves from forests where Vietnamese forces hid and to destroy crops. The military assured soldiers and the public that Agent Orange was harmless to humans. They sprayed it directly over troops. They used it near civilian populations. When veterans started developing cancers, neurological disorders, and having children with birth defects, the government insisted there was no connection. For decades, the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs denied that Agent Orange caused health problems. They commissioned studies and dismissed findings that showed links to disease. Veterans fought for benefits and were systematically denied. It wasn't until 1991 that Congress finally passed the Agent Orange Act, forcing the VA to recognize certain cancers and diseases as service-connected. By then, thousands of veterans had died. Millions of Vietnamese still suffer health effects, and the U.S. has never compensated them. FBI letters to Coretta Scott King. And just when you think the FBI's treatment of civil rights leaders couldn't get worse than the suicide letter to MLK, they had more. The FBI's harassment campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just target him. They went after his wife too. The FBI sent anonymous letters to Coretta Scott King calling her husband a filthy animal. They tried to convince her that MLK was having affairs, using surveillance tapes they'd recorded illegally, hoping she'd leave him and damage his reputation. The letters were cruel, personal, and designed to destroy their marriage. J. Edgar Hoover authorized these operations as part of COINTELPRO. The FBI saw King's civil rights work as a threat to the established order. Destroying his personal life was considered a legitimate tactic to undermine his movement. The letters continued even after King's assassination. The FBI kept files on Coretta Scott King, monitoring her activities as she continued civil rights work. They tracked her for years, considering her a potential threat simply for advocating for justice. These weren't rogue agents. This was institutional policy from the highest levels of federal law enforcement. And we're only 40 facts into this journey, which means there's still plenty more to uncover. Kunduz Hospital Bombing. In October 2015, a US AC-130 gunship circled above a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. For over an hour, it fired on the clearly marked medical facility. 42 people died, including patients in their beds and medical staff trying to help them. Doctors Without Borders had provided GPS coordinates to all parties in the conflict. The hospital was clearly marked with the organization's logo on the roof. It was the only major trauma center in the region. The U.S. military initially claimed they were targeting Taliban fighters. Then they said it was self-defense. Then they said it was a mistake. 16 military personnel received administrative discipline, letters of reprimand, basically. No criminal charges. The military refused to call it a war crime, settling on tragic but avoidable accident. Doctors Without Borders called it what it was, a war crime. They demanded an independent investigation. It never happened. The U.S. investigated itself and concluded it had made an oopsie. Project Shad. And speaking of tests where the U.S. military treated its own sailors as expendable, from 1962 to 1973, the Department of Defense ran Project Shad, Shipboard Hazard and Defense. The name sounds boring. The reality was that the military exposed thousands of Navy sailors to chemical and biological weapons without their knowledge or proper protective equipment. They sprayed ships with nerve gas, including sarin and VX. They released biological agents like E. coli and Bacillus globigii. The sailors were told they were testing new decontamination procedures. They weren't told they were being exposed to actual weapon toxins. The Navy conducted over 100 tests, exposing an estimated 6,000 sailors. Many developed cancers, neurological disorders, and other illnesses decades later. When they applied for VA benefits, the military denied them. Their service records showed no exposure because those records were classified. The Pentagon didn't acknowledge Project Shad until 2000. By then, many test subjects had died. The survivors fought for years to get medical care. Some are still fighting. Operation Midnight Climax continued. But at least those sailors knew they were in the military. Sometimes the CIA preferred civilians who had no idea what was happening. We talked about Operation Midnight Climax earlier, but there's more to this story. The CIA didn't just run these safe houses in San Francisco and New York. They were part of a larger network testing whether sex and drugs could be used for espionage. The agents running the operations weren't scientists or doctors. They were intelligence officers with expense accounts and a mandate to experiment. One CIA officer, George White, ran the San Francisco operation from a safe house while drinking martinis and watching through two-way mirrors. He later wrote in a retirement letter, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun." He thought it was fun to drug unsuspecting civilians. The men who were dosed and watched had no way to get justice. They never knew what happened to them. Many probably thought they'd had bad trips or nervous breakdowns. The program continued for nearly a decade. The math of Cambodia's destruction. And while the CIA was running brothels in California, the military was calculating bombing tonnage in Southeast Asia. Let me give you some numbers that might help you understand the scale of what happened in Cambodia. From July to December 1973, that's roughly 100 days, the U.S. dropped 32 tons of bombs per hour on Cambodia. Every hour. For 100 days straight. That's 240,000 pounds of explosives every 60 minutes. 768 bombs per hour if you average it out. Imagine hearing that every hour for months. Imagine being a rice farmer and watching your country get erased from the sky. The bombing was so intense that pilots ran out of strategic targets. They started bombing anything that moved: villages, water buffalo, rice paddies. The Air Force called it hunting for game. The game was about human beings. All of this was done secretly. Congress didn't authorize it. The American public didn't know. It was only revealed after the fact, when it was too late to stop it and too late for the hundreds of thousands who died. Classified parts of Waco and Ruby Ridge. And speaking of operations the government prefers to keep quiet about, in 1992 at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, and 1993 at Waco, Texas, federal law enforcement operations went catastrophically wrong. At Ruby Ridge, FBI snipers killed a woman holding her baby. At Waco, 76 people died in a fire after a 51-day siege, including 25 children. Here's what's interesting. Significant portions of what happened during these incidents remain classified. FBI rules of engagement, communications between agencies, sniper logs, surveillance footage. Much of it is still sealed decades later. At Ruby Ridge, the Justice Department found the FBI had used unconstitutional rules of engagement. At Waco, questions remain about how the fire started and what the FBI knew about children in the compound. Congressional hearings were held. Reports were written, but key documents stayed classified. The official investigations acknowledged serious mistakes. People were disciplined, though mostly with administrative penalties. But the classified portions mean we'll never know the full story of what the government did and what decisions were made. The CIA and the Dalai Lama. And speaking of covert operations that were later abandoned, the CIA had an interesting relationship with Tibetan resistance fighters. From the late 1950s through the 1960s, the CIA secretly funded and trained Tibetan guerrillas to fight Chinese occupation. They paid the Dalai Lama's administration $1.7 million a year. They trained Tibetan fighters at Camp Hale in Colorado. They supplied weapons, funding, and intelligence support for resistance operations. The program was called Operation St. Circus. The CIA trained several hundred Tibetan fighters in guerrilla warfare and parachuted them back into Tibet. Many were killed. The operations had limited success militarily but created significant intelligence-gathering capabilities. Then, in the early 1970s, President Nixon normalized relations with China. Suddenly, supporting Tibetan resistance wasn't strategically useful anymore. The CIA ended the program. The funding stopped. The Tibetan fighters were abandoned. The Dalai Lama himself received $180,000 annually from the CIA during this period. When the program was exposed in the late 1990s, he confirmed it but said the money had supported Tibetan refugees, not his personal use. Selling chemical weapons precursors to Saddam. And speaking of strategically convenient relationships that later became embarrassing, throughout the 1980s, while Iraq and Iran were at war, the United States sold Iraq chemical and biological weapons precursors. We're talking about the compounds needed to make sarin, VX nerve gas, and anthrax. We sold them to Saddam Hussein. On purpose. The Reagan administration removed Iraq from the state sponsors of terrorism list in 1982, specifically to allow weapon sales. American companies with government approval exported bacteria cultures, chemical precursors, and dual-use technology to Iraq. We knew Saddam was using chemical weapons against Iran. We knew because we were providing satellite imagery to help Iraqi forces target Iranian troops. When Saddam gassed the Kurdish town of Halabja in 1988, killing 5,000 civilians, the U.S. response was muted. Fast forward to 2003, and we invaded Iraq partly because of weapons of mass destruction. The irony is that many of those weapons' capabilities came from materials we sold them. We armed him, then went to war over the fact that he was armed. Einstein's FBI file. And speaking of files the government kept on people who probably didn't deserve surveillance, Albert Einstein, Nobel Prize winner, refugee from Nazi Germany, greatest physicist of the 20th century, had an FBI file that was 1,427 pages long. J. Edgar Hoover considered him a security risk. Why? Because Einstein was a pacifist. He supported civil rights. He criticized McCarthyism. He advocated for nuclear disarmament. These positions apparently made him dangerous enough to warrant decades of surveillance. The FBI tracked his movements, read his mail, tapped his phones, and infiltrated organizations he belonged to. They compiled reports on his speeches, his associates, and his political views. They investigated whether he was a Soviet spy or communist sympathizer. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Einstein was aware of the surveillance. He once joked about it. But the FBI's obsession with him continued until his death in 1955. The file was partially released through FOIA requests. You can read it yourself, page after page of America's security apparatus treating a brilliant refugee as a threat because he believed in peace. 700+ military bases. And speaking of America's global presence and how we project power around the world, the United States currently operates approximately 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. Not counting the roughly 5,000 installations inside the U.S., just the foreign ones. 750 bases on other people's land. No other country comes close. Russia has around 30 foreign bases. China has about 10. The British Empire at its height had fewer foreign bases than America has today. We have bases in Germany, Japan, South Korea, Italy, the UK, Turkey, Qatar, Djibouti, everywhere. Some are massive complexes housing thousands of troops. Others are small outposts or lily pad bases for special operations. Together, they cost over $200 billion annually to maintain. They enable the U.S. to project military power anywhere in the world within hours. The Pentagon calls it forward presence. Critics call it an empire. Either way, it's a network of military installations that spans the globe, most of which Americans couldn't name or locate on a map. The Pat Tillman cover-up. And sometimes, even with all that military infrastructure, the government still lies to families about how their loved ones died. Pat Tillman gave up a $3.6 million NFL contract to join the Army Rangers after September 11th. In April 2004, he was killed in Afghanistan. The Army immediately reported he died heroically in combat, killed by enemy fire. They awarded him a Silver Star. They held a nationally televised memorial service. President Bush and military leaders praised his sacrifice. Except none of it was true. Tillman was killed by friendly fire. His own unit shot him. The Army knew within hours. They destroyed evidence, including Tillman's uniform and body armor. They ordered soldiers to lie. They created a false narrative about his death and promoted it for weeks while his family grieved. The truth only came out because Tillman's family demanded answers and refused to accept the official story. Eventually, the Army admitted the cover-up. Officers were reprimanded. No one went to prison. The lies had already served their propaganda purpose. Tillman's brother said at the funeral, "He wasn't religious, so thanks for your thoughts, but he's dead." The Army had turned his death into a patriotic story. The reality was messier, uglier, and human. The term, conspiracy theorist. And speaking of phrases designed to control narratives, there's a popular claim that the CIA invented the term conspiracy theorist to discredit critics after the JFK assassination. The actual story is more complicated. The term existed before the 1960s, but the CIA did weaponize it. In 1967, the CIA issued a memo to its stations discussing how to respond to critics of the Warren Commission. Document 1035 to 960 suggested calling critics conspiracy theorists and emphasizing they had no evidence. The memo advised using propaganda assets to counter criticism in newspapers and magazines. So while the CIA didn't invent the phrase, they did create a strategy to use it as a put-down to dismiss dissent. It worked. Conspiracy theorist became shorthand for crazy person with wild ideas. The term itself became a thought-terminating cliché. Now, whenever someone questions official narratives, they risk being labeled a conspiracy theorist, which immediately discredits them in public discourse. It's brilliant propaganda. The CIA turned skepticism of the government into something socially unacceptable, supporting the Khmer Rouge. And speaking of uncomfortable truths about foreign policy, let's talk about who America chose to back after one of the 20th century's worst genocides. After the Khmer Rouge killed roughly 2 million Cambodians in their genocidal regime from 1975 to 1979, Vietnam invaded Cambodia and drove them from power. You'd think the world would thank Vietnam. Instead, the United States supported the Khmer Rouge. Not publicly, of course. But from 1979 through the late 1980s, the U.S. backed a coalition that included the Khmer Rouge at the United Nations. We voted to keep them as Cambodia's official representative. We provided indirect support to resistance forces fighting the Vietnamese-backed government. Why? Because Vietnam was aligned with the Soviet Union, and Cold War logic said the enemy of our enemy was our friend, even if that friend had just committed genocide. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, said, "I encouraged the Chinese to support Pol Pot." Henry Kissinger reportedly said it was preferable for the Khmer Rouge to continue fighting. The U.S. also supported Thailand's efforts to arm Khmer Rouge guerrillas. This continued well into the Reagan administration. We chose geopolitical positioning over basic human morality. Anthrax attacks and the wrong man. And speaking of operations that test the boundaries of belief, in September and October 2001, just after September 11th, someone mailed anthrax-laced letters to news organizations and senators. 5 people died. 17 others were infected. The nation panicked. The FBI launched the largest investigation in its history, called Amerithrax. They initially focused on Dr. Stephen Hatfill, a bioweapons expert. They publicly named him a person of interest, destroyed his career, and surveilled him for years. In 2008, Hatfill sued and won $5.8 million because the FBI had no evidence against him. Then the FBI switched to Dr. Bruce Ivins, who worked at Fort Detrick. As the investigation closed in, Ivins died by suicide in 2008. The FBI closed the case, declaring him guilty. Except they never charged him. No trial, no conviction, just a dead suspect and a closed case. Many scientists questioned the FBI's evidence. The National Academy of Sciences reviewed the genetic analysis and found it didn't conclusively link the anthrax to Ivins. To this day, serious questions remain about who actually sent the letters. America at war 93% of the time. And speaking of America's relationship with warfare, the United States has been at war during approximately 93% of its existence. Out of 249 years as a nation, we've experienced only about 17 years of total peace. We've been involved in hundreds of military operations, conflicts, and wars. Some were formally declared by Congress. Most weren't. We've fought in North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Central America, South America, everywhere. Since World War II alone, we've bombed or invaded Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Guatemala, Indonesia, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Lebanon, Libya, Panama, Iraq multiple times, Somalia, Bosnia, Sudan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Syria. That's not a complete list. The U.S. hasn't formally declared war since 1942. Yet we've been in continuous military operations ever since. We've normalized permanent warfare as a feature of American existence. Most Americans alive today have never experienced a time when their country wasn't bombing someone somewhere. Still classified JFK files. And speaking of secrets the government still keeps from that era of constant conflict, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. That was over 60 years ago. The Warren Commission released its report in 1964. The House Select Committee investigated again in the late 1970s. And yet thousands of documents remain classified. In 2017, President Trump released some files but held back others at the request of intelligence agencies. In 2021, President Biden released more but kept approximately 3,000 documents fully or partially classified, citing national security concerns. National security concerns about a 6-decade-old murder. What exactly needs to be protected? What's so sensitive that it can't be revealed after all this time? The official reason given is protecting intelligence sources and methods. The practical effect is sustaining conspiracy theories and public distrust. When the government refuses to release information about a president's assassination after 60 years, people naturally assume there's something to hide. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But the secrecy itself has become part of the story. Air America and the heroin trade. And speaking of intelligence operations that were eventually confirmed, let's talk about drug trafficking in Southeast Asia. During the Vietnam War, the CIA ran an airline called Air America. Officially, it transported supplies and personnel. Unofficially, it was deeply involved in the Southeast Asian heroin trade. The CIA worked with Hmong allies in Laos who funded their operations by growing opium. Air America planes transported opium from remote villages to processing facilities. The heroin then made its way to South Vietnamese cities where it was sold to U.S. soldiers and exported internationally. Journalists exposed this in the early 1970s. Alfred McCoy's book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, documented it in detail. The CIA denied everything. Then, decades later, declassified documents and testimony from CIA operatives confirmed the agency had looked the other way or actively facilitated drug trafficking to support anti-communist forces. The exact level of direct CIA involvement remains debated, but their complicity is well documented. They prioritized covert operations over stopping the flow of heroin that was addicting American soldiers and fueling organized crime. Deliberate hospital bombings in North Vietnam. And speaking of the human cost of that war beyond drug addiction, throughout the Vietnam War, the U.S. claimed it avoided targeting civilian infrastructure like hospitals. Declassified documents and photographic evidence tell a different story. American forces deliberately bombed hospitals in North Vietnam. The Bach Mai Hospital in Hanoi was repeatedly damaged by U.S. bombing. The December 1972 Christmas bombing campaign hit residential areas, schools, and medical facilities. Photographs show destroyed hospital wards, killed medical staff, and dead patients. The Pentagon maintained these were accidents or that hospitals were military targets because North Vietnamese forces used them for military purposes. But pattern analysis of bombing targets shows repeated hits on the same medical facilities over extended periods. International observers, including physicians from Western countries who visited North Vietnam, documented the destruction and testified that these were functioning civilian hospitals providing medical care. The U.S. never acknowledged deliberately targeting medical facilities, but the evidence suggests precision bombing that hit hospitals wasn't always accidental. Infected blankets at Fort Pitt. And speaking of deliberate harm inflicted on civilians, let's go back to the very founding of American colonialism. In 1763, during Pontiac's Rebellion, British forces at Fort Pitt faced a siege by Native American forces. Captain Simeon A. Quire decided on a biological warfare solution. He gave smallpox-infected blankets to Delaware representatives during a peace negotiation. This isn't a myth or legend. It's documented in historical records. Quire wrote in his journal, "We gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect." His commanding officer, Colonel Henry Bouquet, had explicitly suggested this tactic in written correspondence. The smallpox did spread among the native population, though historians debate whether the blankets were the primary vector or if the disease was already present. What's indisputable is that British colonial officers deliberately attempted to spread a deadly disease to Native Americans during wartime. This practice became part of a longer pattern of biological warfare and disease used as a weapon against indigenous populations. The U.S. government inherited both the land and some of the tactics from the British colonial administration. And with that particularly dark moment from the 18th century, we've reached fact 58. Your eyes are heavy. The government's history is heavier. And there are still 42 more facts waiting in the darkness. Forced displacement of Japanese Americans. In February 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, forcing 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. 2/3 were U.S. citizens. Many were children. Families were given days to sell their homes, businesses, and possessions. They were imprisoned in camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers in remote locations across the western United States. Families lived in cramped barracks with no privacy. They lost everything: their homes, their businesses, their communities, their freedom. Not because of any evidence of disloyalty, because of their ethnicity. Meanwhile, German Americans and Italian Americans, whose ancestral countries we were also fighting, faced no mass incarceration. The internment was ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court in Korematsu versus United States, a decision that stood for decades. It wasn't until 1988 that Congress formally apologized and paid reparations of $20,000 to surviving internees. President Reagan signed the bill. The government finally acknowledged what Japanese Americans already knew. It was racism, not security. Involuntary servitude through convict leasing. And speaking of violations that took decades to acknowledge, let's talk about another program that destroyed lives. After the Civil War ended slavery in 1865, Southern states found a loophole. The 13th Amendment banned slavery except as punishment for crime. So they criminalized everyday black life and created the convict leasing system. Black people were arrested for vagrancy, being unemployed, or for minor infractions like talking too loudly. Once convicted, they were leased to private companies to work in mines, lumber camps, turpentine farms, and plantations. The conditions were often worse than slavery because companies had no financial interest in keeping workers alive. They could just lease more. Thousands died from exhaustion, disease, beatings, and industrial accidents. It was slavery by another name, sanctioned by state governments and blessed by federal courts. The system persisted well into the 20th century. Alabama didn't formally end convict leasing until 1928. This wasn't ancient history. People who experienced it lived into the 1960s and 1970s. The system evolved into chain gangs and prison labor that continues today, with incarcerated people working for pennies per hour. And as we hit Fact 60, the weight of history presses down like those prison chains. And there are still 41 more truths to uncover before you drift off to sleep. NSA metadata collection. And speaking of surveillance systems that never really ended, let's talk about your phone. Every call you make, the NSA probably knows about it. Not the content necessarily, though maybe that too, but the metadata, who you called, when you called them, how long you talked, where you were when you made the call. The NSA collects this information on nearly all phone calls made in the United States. They claim it's just metadata, as if that makes it less invasive. But metadata reveals patterns of your life, who your friends are, your doctors, your lawyers, your romantic interests, your political affiliations. This program was revealed through Edward Snowden's leaks in 2013. The government's defense was that it's just metadata, and it's essential for fighting terrorism. Courts have ruled both ways on whether it's constitutional. The program continues in modified form today. Your calls are being logged. The government is building a database of American social connections, supporting Jonas Savimbi in Angola. And speaking of American connections to violence abroad, sometimes those connections funded some truly horrific conflicts. During the Cold War, Angola's civil war became a proxy battlefield. The Soviet Union backed the MPLA government. The U.S. decided to back UNITA rebels led by Jonas Savimbi. From the 1970s through the 1990s, the CIA funneled weapons, training, and hundreds of millions of dollars to Savimbi. Savimbi was brutal. His forces used child soldiers, committed massacres, planted landmines indiscriminately, and terrorized civilians. Conservative estimates put the death toll from Angola's civil war at 500,000 people. Some estimates go much higher. The U.S. continued supporting Savimbi even after the Cold War ended. President Reagan called him a freedom fighter and invited him to the White House. The war continued until Savimbi was killed in 2002, after which peace finally came. Angola is still dealing with the aftermath. Landmines everywhere, destroyed infrastructure, a traumatized population. The U.S. backed Savimbi for decades because he was anti-communist, regardless of the human cost. Prison medical experiments. And speaking of human costs in the name of research, the government didn't always go abroad for test subjects. From the 1940s through the 1970s, pharmaceutical companies and government agencies used American prisoners as test subjects for medical experiments. Prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria, viral hepatitis, and other diseases to test treatments. At Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois, prisoners were infected with malaria over 400 times between 1944 and 1974. At Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania, prisoners were exposed to chemical agents, pathogens, and pharmaceuticals. Many were paid small amounts, a few dollars, for participating in experiments that could permanently damage their health. The ethical problem is obvious. Prisoners can't truly consent. They're in a coercive environment where participating in experiments might earn privileges or reduce sentences. Yet this practice continued for decades with government approval. Some prisoners developed chronic illnesses. Some died. Most were never followed up with after release. The full extent of these experiments only became public through investigations in the 1970s. Funding the Mujahideen. And speaking of funding questionable allies during the Cold War, one of America's proxy relationships would come back to haunt us. In the 1980s, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the CIA launched Operation Cyclone, the largest covert operation in CIA history. Over $3 billion in weapons, training, and support flowed to Afghan Mujahideen fighters resisting Soviet occupation. The CIA worked with Pakistani intelligence to distribute weapons. They provided Stinger missiles that turned the tide of the war. They trained fighters in guerrilla tactics and sabotage. The operation was enormously successful at bleeding the Soviet Union and contributing to its eventual collapse. The problem was who we were funding. The Mujahideen weren't a unified democratic resistance. They included warlords, religious extremists, and people who would later form the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden was part of the network, receiving indirect support through Pakistani and Saudi channels. When the Soviets withdrew in 1989, the U.S. largely abandoned Afghanistan. The country descended into civil war. The Taliban emerged, and some of the people we'd armed and trained became our enemies. No reparations for slavery. And speaking of historical injustices America has never quite addressed, slavery existed in what became the United States for 246 years. Millions of people were enslaved, their labor stolen, their families destroyed, their humanity denied. The economic value they created built much of America's wealth. After the Civil War, there was a brief moment when freed slaves might receive compensation. 40 acres and a mule was discussed. Land redistribution from Confederate estates to formerly enslaved people. It never happened. President Andrew Johnson reversed the policy, returning confiscated land to former slaveholders. No reparations were ever paid to freed slaves or their descendants. Meanwhile, former slaveholders in some cases received compensation for their property loss when slaves were freed. The government paid the owners, not the enslaved. In recent decades, the reparations debate has resurfaced. Some municipalities have created programs, but no federal reparations have been paid. The wealth gap between black and white Americans, directly traceable to slavery and subsequent discrimination, remains enormous. Radioactive particles over St. Louis. And speaking of harm inflicted on black communities, sometimes it came from the sky. In the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. military conducted secret tests spraying radioactive particles over St. Louis. They mounted chemical dispersal equipment on buildings and vehicles in predominantly black neighborhoods and released zinc-cadmium sulfide mixed with radioactive particles. The military claimed the tests were to create smoke screens to protect cities from Soviet attacks. They said the compounds were harmless. Decades later, researchers discovered the tests had used radioactive materials and that the military had specifically targeted poor minority neighborhoods. Residents were never informed. Children played outside while radioactive particles settled on their schools and homes. Some areas were sprayed up to 1,600 times. Studies have suggested potential links between the tests and cancer clusters in those neighborhoods. The full extent of the tests wasn't revealed until 1994, when journalists uncovered documents through FOIA requests. The Army maintained the materials were safe, but families affected remain unconvinced. FBI sexual blackmail operations. And speaking of government agencies abusing their power for leverage, the FBI had some particularly dark tactics. J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI for 48 years, and during that time he accumulated files on politicians, judges, and prominent figures containing information about their private lives, especially their sex lives. These files were weapons. The FBI used surveillance, wiretaps, and informants to gather compromising information, then used it to blackmail officials into compliance. If a congressman opposed Hoover or threatened FBI funding, suddenly information about affairs or sexual orientation might leak. The threat was usually enough. Hoover allegedly had files on multiple presidents and used them to ensure his position was secure. He survived 8 presidents and wielded power far beyond his official role because people feared what he knew. The FBI also ran active sexual entrapment operations similar to the CIA's Operation Midnight Climax. They'd facilitate compromising situations, document them, then use the evidence for blackmail or to neutralize political opponents. After Hoover's death, reforms were supposed to prevent this abuse. But the infrastructure of surveillance he built largely remained. Depleted uranium in Iraq. And speaking of lasting consequences from American military operations, some weapons leave poison that lasts generations. During the Gulf War and the Iraq War, the U.S. military used depleted uranium ammunition extensively. It's incredibly dense and effective at piercing armor. It's also radioactive and toxic. When depleted uranium rounds hit targets, they create dust that can be inhaled or ingested. This dust settles into soil and water. The military said it posed minimal health risk. But since the wars, Iraq has seen dramatic increases in birth defects and childhood cancers, particularly in areas of heavy fighting like Fallujah. Studies have documented elevated uranium levels in soil, water, and human tissue in affected areas. Iraqi doctors report rates of congenital disabilities far above pre-war levels. Some birth defects are severe and heartbreaking: children born with major organ problems, skeletal deformities, neurological damage. The U.S. Department of Defense maintains that depleted uranium is safe when handled properly. But handled properly doesn't account for civilian populations living in contaminated areas for decades after the fighting ends. The half-life of uranium-238 is 4.5 billion years. The WMD lies. And speaking of justifications for that war that turned out to be false, in 2002 and 2003, the Bush administration built the case for invading Iraq on the claim that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Secretary of State Colin Powell presented evidence at the United Nations. President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and other officials repeatedly warned that Iraq had chemical and biological weapons and was pursuing nuclear weapons. The invasion happened in March 2003. As troops searched Iraq, they found nothing. No stockpiles of chemical weapons, no biological weapons programs, no nuclear weapons programs. The intelligence had been wrong, or more accurately, it had been manipulated and exaggerated. The famous mobile biological weapons labs were weather balloon equipment. The aluminum tubes supposedly for nuclear centrifuges were for conventional rockets. The yellowcake uranium from Niger was based on forged documents. Investigations later revealed that intelligence agencies had doubts about the WMD claims, but those doubts were suppressed or ignored. The administration cherry-picked intelligence that supported the predetermined decision to invade. Over 4,000 American troops died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And speaking of government-funded media operations, sometimes propaganda doesn't hide what it is. During the Cold War, the CIA created and funded Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, broadcasting stations that transmitted news and programming into Soviet-controlled territories. On the surface, they were independent news organizations. In reality, they were propaganda operations funded by American intelligence. Radio Free Europe targeted Eastern European countries. Radio Liberty targeted the Soviet Union itself. They broadcast pro-Western content, anti-communist messaging, and information designed to undermine Soviet authority. They were remarkably effective at getting around Soviet censorship. The CIA's involvement was supposed to be secret. When it was exposed in the late 1960s, it caused a scandal. The stations were transferred to a more transparent government board, but their mission remained essentially the same: to shape public opinion in foreign countries. To be fair, they also provided genuine news that people in closed societies couldn't access elsewhere. But they were fundamentally propaganda tools, government-funded media designed to influence foreign populations. They still exist today, now called Radio Free Europe/Radio Liberty, openly funded by Congress, still broadcasting to countries where press freedom is limited. 50-plus government overthrows. And speaking of American interventions, if radio stations barely scratched the surface since World War II, the United States has attempted to overthrow or successfully overthrown more than 50 foreign governments. 50. Some were coups, some were invasions, some were covert operations, some combined all three. We've already mentioned Iran, Guatemala, Congo, Chile, and others. But the full list includes Indonesia, Brazil, Dominican Republic, South Vietnam, Ghana, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and those are just the confirmed ones. The methods vary. Sometimes, it's a direct military invasion. Sometimes it's CIA-backed coups. Sometimes it's funding opposition groups, running propaganda campaigns, imposing sanctions designed to cause economic collapse and popular uprising. The justifications were usually anti-communism during the Cold War, then terrorism or humanitarian intervention afterward. The results were often disastrous. Civil wars, dictatorships, destabilization that lasted decades. Very few Americans know the extent of this. It's not taught in schools. These interventions happened in the shadows, were classified for decades, or were simply never widely reported. Downwinders and atomic testing. And sometimes the government hurts Americans while claiming to protect them from foreign threats. From 1945 to 1962, the United States conducted over 100 atmospheric nuclear tests in Nevada. The mushroom clouds were visible from Las Vegas. Tourists came to watch. The government assured everyone it was perfectly safe. It wasn't safe. Radioactive fallout drifted over communities in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. Thousands of people, called downwinders, were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. They weren't warned. They weren't evacuated. They weren't even told they were being exposed. Cancer rates in these communities skyrocketed. Leukemia, thyroid cancer, bone cancer, diseases directly linked to radiation exposure. Children who played outside when fallout was drifting overhead. Families who drank milk from cows that ate contaminated grass. The government denied any health effects for decades. It wasn't until 1990 that Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, providing payments to downwinders and nuclear test workers. But many victims had already died, and the compensation didn't come close to covering the medical costs and suffering. The military knew the tests were dangerous. They monitored radiation levels. They just didn't tell the people living downwind. The FBI's Aretha Franklin file. And speaking of people the FBI monitored for surprising reasons, Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, one of the greatest singers in American history, had a 700-page FBI file. The FBI monitored her for decades because she sang at civil rights events and associated with activists. The FBI was particularly interested in her connection to the Black Panther Party and her friendship with Angela Davis. They tracked her concert appearances, monitored her travel, and noted her political associations. Being friends with the wrong people and singing at the wrong events made you a surveillance target. The file shows the FBI was concerned about her militant connections, as if being a black woman who supported civil rights was inherently threatening. They monitored her European tours, concerned she might spread anti-American sentiment abroad. Aretha knew about the surveillance. She spoke about being monitored and having her phones tapped. Like Einstein, John Lennon, and Martin Luther King, she was considered a threat simply for using her platform to advocate for justice. The FBI was more concerned with watching artists and activists than with actual threats. Classified UFO documents. And speaking of things the government watches but won't tell us about, the U.S. government denied having any interest in UFOs, or UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. That changed recently when the Pentagon admitted that yes, they've been investigating these things all along. Thousands of documents remain classified. Military pilots have reported encounters with objects performing maneuvers that seem to defy known physics. Some incidents were captured on radar and infrared. The government has acknowledged these encounters are real, but most of the details remain secret. What do they know? What have they recovered? What explanations have they ruled out? The classification continues. In 2023, Congress held hearings where former intelligence officials testified about crash retrieval programs and non-human technology. The Pentagon denied these claims, but the documents that might prove or disprove these claims, still classified. Maybe there's a mundane explanation. Maybe it's foreign technology. Maybe it's something else. What's certain is the government has information they're not sharing, and that secrecy fuels speculation. Acoustic Kitty. And speaking of operations that sound like science fiction but were entirely real, in the 1960s the CIA had an idea, What if we could use cats as mobile listening devices? So they launched Project Acoustic Kitty. They surgically implanted microphones, radio transmitters, and an antenna into cats. The plan was to release these modified cats near Soviet embassies and eavesdrop on conversations. The first field test was reportedly a disaster. They released the cat near a Soviet target in Washington, D.C. It was immediately hit by a taxi. The cat died. The operation was over. The CIA spent about $20 million on the project over 5 years before abandoning it. The main problem, beyond cats getting hit by cars, was that cats don't follow orders. You can't direct a cat to go sit near specific people. Cats do what cats want. The project was declassified in 2001. The CIA admitted it happened but claimed the taxi story might be exaggerated. Either way, they definitely tried to turn cats into cyborg spies. Supporting genocide in East Timor. And speaking of operations with much darker consequences than dead cats, in 1975, Indonesia invaded East Timor. Over the next quarter century, Indonesian forces killed approximately 100,000 to 300,000 people, about a third of East Timor's population, through direct violence, starvation, and disease. The United States knew about the invasion before it happened. President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger met with Indonesian President Suharto just hours before the invasion began. They gave him a green light. Indonesia was an anti-communist ally. East Timor's independence movement had leftist elements. The Cold War logic applied. For the next 24 years, the U.S. provided Indonesia with weapons, military training, and diplomatic cover at the UN. We knew about the massacres. We kept supplying weapons. American-made aircraft and weapons were used to kill civilians. The genocide only ended in 1999, after the Cold War was over and international pressure finally forced Indonesia to allow a referendum. East Timor became independent in 2002. The U.S. supported Suharto's regime throughout the genocide. We prioritized strategic interests over 100,000 to 300,000 lives. The USS Liberty incident. And speaking of attacks where official explanations don't quite satisfy, on June 8, 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israeli forces attacked the USS Liberty, an American naval intelligence ship in international waters. Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats struck the ship for over 2 hours, killing 34 crew members and wounding 171. Israel claimed it was a case of mistaken identity. They thought it was an Egyptian ship. The U.S. government accepted this explanation, but many survivors and investigators have questioned this account. The Liberty was flying an American flag. It had clear U.S. Navy markings. The attack lasted 2 hours in good visibility. Some survivors believe Israel attacked deliberately because the Liberty was monitoring communications during Israel's operations. The Johnson administration allegedly suppressed the investigation to maintain relations with Israel. Crew members who tried to speak publicly about inconsistencies in the official story faced pressure to remain silent. Documents remain classified. Official investigations concluded it was an accident, but questions persist decades later. The U.S. response was notably restrained compared to how it typically responds when American service members are killed. Torture program after September 11th. And speaking of operations that definitely weren't accidents, let's talk about what happened after September 11th. After September 11th, the CIA established a network of secret prisons called black sites around the world. They detained suspects without trial and subjected them to what the government called enhanced interrogation techniques. Everyone else called it torture, waterboarding, sleep deprivation for up to 180 hours, confinement in coffin-sized boxes, stress positions, hypothermia, rectal feeding. At least 119 detainees went through the program. At least 39 were tortured. Some detainees were innocent. Gul Rahman froze to death in a CIA black site because guards stripped him naked and left him chained to a concrete floor. Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded 83 times. And the CIA later admitted he wasn't even a member of Al-Qaeda. The Senate Intelligence Committee investigated and produced a 6,000-page report. Only the 500-page summary was released. It concluded the torture was brutal, ineffective, and that the CIA lied about it to Congress and the president. No one was prosecuted. The program officially ended, but accountability never came. Highest incarceration rate in history. And speaking of America's relationship with imprisonment, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. We have less than 5% of the world's population but nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. Over 2 million people are incarcerated in American prisons and jails right now. This isn't because Americans are uniquely criminal. It's because of policy choices, the war on drugs, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, harsh sentencing guidelines. These policies disproportionately affected Black and Latino communities. The incarceration rate increased 700% from the 1970s to the 2000s. Private prison companies profit from this. Communities are destroyed by mass incarceration. Families are separated. People lose voting rights, job opportunities, housing access. The U.S. incarcerates more people than authoritarian regimes we criticize for human rights violations. We imprison people at higher rates than Stalin's Soviet Union at the height of the gulags. That's not hyperbole. That's statistical reality. The system is designed to maintain itself. Prisons need prisoners. Gain-of-function research funding. And speaking of controversial government decisions with global implications, for years, the U.S. government funded research that involved making viruses more dangerous called gain-of-function research. The idea was to study how viruses might evolve to better prepare for pandemics. The risk was creating more dangerous viruses that could escape the lab. The National Institutes of Health funded coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China through grants to EcoHealth Alliance. This research involved modifying bat coronaviruses. When COVID-19 emerged from Wuhan, questions arose about whether lab research could have been involved. The exact origins of COVID-19 remain disputed. But what's clear is that the U.S. government funded risky virus research at a lab in the same city where a pandemic started, then initially dismissed lab leak theories as conspiracy theories. Congress has held hearings. Documents show the research was riskier than initially disclosed. Some officials denied funding gain-of-function research, then later acknowledged it met the technical definition. Whatever the origins of COVID, the controversy revealed that the government funded potentially dangerous research with insufficient oversight in foreign labs, then wasn't fully transparent about it. And with that, we've reached fact 80. 21 more remain. Your eyelids are heavy. The government's secrets are heavier. FBI agents provocateurs in anti-war movement. And speaking of infiltration, the FBI didn't just watch the anti-war movement during Vietnam. They actively tried to destroy it from within. They planted agents provocateurs who encouraged violence, created division, and committed crimes to discredit peaceful protesters. These agents would show up at meetings and push for radical action. They'd suggest bombing campaigns or violent confrontations. When activists resisted, the agents would create factions and splits. Some planted evidence. Others committed acts of vandalism and blamed activists. The goal was to turn public opinion against the anti-war movement by making it seem violent and extreme. It worked remarkably well. Many groups collapsed under the pressure of internal suspicion and external prosecution. Years later, these operations were exposed. But the damage was permanent. More bombs on Laos than Japan. And speaking of damage the government did to Southeast Asia, we mentioned the secret bombing of Laos earlier, but here's the scale. The United States dropped more bombs on Laos than on Japan during all of World War II. Japan, an industrialized nation we fought for years. More bombs than that dropped on a small, neutral agricultural country. Over 2 million tons on Laos. Japan received about 160,000 tons. That's more than 12 times the tonnage. In a country roughly the size of Utah. On a population of about 2 million people. The bombing lasted 9 years. Every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, another plane load. The country is still covered in unexploded ordnance that kills people every year. And the American public didn't know it was happening. No acknowledgement for COINTELPRO victims. And speaking of things that happened that still haven't been acknowledged, COINTELPRO was exposed in the 1970s. The FBI admitted to illegal surveillance, harassment, and disruption of activist groups. Congressional hearings were held. Reforms were promised. But here's what didn't happen. No official acknowledgement of victims. No comprehensive compensation program. No clearing of criminal records for people framed by FBI agents. No apologies to families of activists who were targeted, imprisoned, or killed because of FBI operations. Some individuals sued and won settlements. But there was no systematic process to identify and compensate everyone harmed by 15 years of illegal government operations. Many victims died never receiving acknowledgement of what was done to them. The FBI kept the files. Some remained partially classified. But accountability? That never fully materialized. Operation Mockingbird. And speaking of government control of information, in the 1950s the CIA launched Operation Mockingbird, a program to influence American media. They recruited journalists from major news organizations to serve as intelligence assets. These journalists would plant stories, gather intelligence, and shape coverage to favor CIA interests. The agency had relationships with reporters at the New York Times, CBS, Time magazine, and other major outlets. Some journalists knowingly cooperated. Others were manipulated without realizing it. The CIA used these connections to plant propaganda disguised as news. The program was exposed in the 1970s by the Church Committee. The CIA claimed to have ended it. But the infrastructure of government media relationships continued. And journalists who cooperated faced no consequences. When the government can shape what you read in the newspaper, truth becomes negotiable. Napalm on children. And speaking of truths about Vietnam that took too long to acknowledge, the image of Phan Thi Kim Phuc, the 9-year-old Vietnamese girl running naked down a road, her skin burning from napalm, became one of the most iconic photographs of the Vietnam War. That photo was taken in 1972 by Nick Ut. The U.S. dropped napalm extensively throughout Vietnam. It sticks to skin and burns at temperatures up to 1,200 degrees Celsius. It's designed to be unextinguishable. Children caught in napalm strikes faced horrific burns and often died. The military knew civilians, including children, were being killed by napalm. They continued using it anyway. Over 388,000 tons of napalm were dropped on Vietnam. Kim Phuc survived. She lives in Canada now and has spent her life working for peace. The napalm didn't kill her, but she carries the scars. Biological weapons tested on prisoners. And speaking of testing weapons on vulnerable populations, we mentioned medical experiments on prisoners earlier, but some experiments specifically involved biological weapons. At facilities like Stateville and other prisons, inmates were exposed to potential bioweapons to study infection patterns and test vaccines. These weren't just disease studies. They were weapons development programs. The military wanted to know how biological agents would spread, how effective vaccines would be, and how to weaponize diseases. Prisoners were paid minimal amounts to participate. They couldn't truly consent in a coercive environment. Many developed serious illnesses. Some died. The testing continued for decades with government approval. After the Biological Weapons Convention banned offensive bioweapons research in 1975, these programs supposedly ended. But the data collected from prison experiments remained classified for decades. Fred Hampton's floor plan. And speaking of deadly operations that remained classified, on December 4, 1969, Chicago police raided Black Panther leader Fred Hampton's apartment before dawn. They fired over 90 shots. Hampton was killed in his bed. He was 21 years old. The police claimed they had been fired upon first. Ballistics showed that of the 99 shots fired, only one came from inside the apartment, and it may have been fired after Hampton was already dead. Years later, documents revealed that the FBI had an informant inside Hampton's security detail. That informant, William O'Neill, provided the FBI with a detailed floor plan of Hampton's apartment, marking where Hampton slept. The FBI shared this information with Chicago police. Hampton was likely drugged that night. The raid was essentially an assassination. It was part of COINTELPRO's campaign to neutralize Black Panther leadership, not ratifying Children's Rights Convention. And speaking of international agreements America refuses to sign, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted in 1989. It's the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history. 196 countries have ratified it. The United States is the only UN member state that hasn't ratified it. We've signed it but never ratified it, meaning it's not binding law. Why? Various reasons have been given over the years. Concerns about parental rights, opposition to restricting juvenile life imprisonment, resistance to international law superseding state law. The result is that America stands alone in refusing to formally commit to international standards for children's rights. We're in the company of no one. Every other country has ratified it. My Lai massacre cover-up. And speaking of atrocities America was slow to acknowledge, on March 16, 1968, American soldiers murdered between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai. Women, children, elderly people, executed in ditches, their homes burned. The army initially reported it as a military victory against Viet Cong forces. They claimed 200 combatants killed and minimal civilian casualties. It was a complete fabrication. A helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson, who witnessed the massacre, tried to stop it and later reported it. The army covered it up for over a year. It only became public when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh exposed it in November 1969. 26 soldiers were charged. Only one, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He served 3.5 years under house arrest. The cover-up went all the way up the chain of command, discrediting Gary Webb. And speaking of journalists who exposed uncomfortable truths, remember Gary Webb, the journalist who exposed CIA connections to cocaine trafficking? After major newspapers attacked his reporting, he lost his job and his career was destroyed. He died in 2004 from 2 gunshot wounds to the head, ruled a suicide. But here's what happened after his death. The CIA's own Inspector General report confirmed much of what Webb reported. Other journalists revisited his work and validated it. He'd been right. The initial attacks on Webb came partly from CIA public relations efforts. The agency launched a campaign to discredit his reporting, feeding information to friendly journalists who then attacked Webb's credibility. It worked. Webb was professionally destroyed. Years later, the truth vindicated him, but he wasn't alive to see it. Contra trafficking cocaine. And speaking of the cocaine connection he exposed, the Nicaraguan Contras that the U.S. funded in the 1980s weren't just fighting communists. They were trafficking cocaine into the United States. Multiple investigations confirmed this. The Kerry Committee report in 1989 found that individuals and companies involved in the Contra supply network engaged in drug trafficking. The CIA's Inspector General report in 1998 confirmed the agency knew about it and did nothing. Senior Contra officials were drug traffickers. The infrastructure the U.S. helped build for supplying the Contras was used to smuggle cocaine. The DEA knew. The CIA knew. They prioritized funding the Contras over stopping drug trafficking. The crack epidemic that devastated American cities in the 1980s had direct connections to Contra cocaine trafficking. Frank Olson's fall. And speaking of the lengths the CIA would go to test drugs on people, in 1953, CIA biochemist Frank Olson fell to his death from a 13th-floor hotel window in New York. The CIA claimed it was suicide. His family was told he'd had a psychotic break. 22 years later, the truth came out. The CIA had dosed Olson with LSD without his knowledge as part of MKUltra experiments. He fell from the window 9 days later. The CIA paid the family $750,000 and apologized. But questions remained. In 1994, Olson's body was exhumed. A forensic pathologist found evidence suggesting he'd been struck on the head before going out the window. The family believes he was murdered. The CIA has never fully explained what happened that night. Olson's death remains officially a suicide, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Catholic worker movement as threat. And speaking of organizations the FBI considered threatening, the Catholic worker movement, founded in 1933 by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, advocates for nonviolence, voluntary poverty, and helping the poor. They run soup kitchens and homeless shelters. They're pacifists inspired by Catholic social teaching. The FBI considered them a threat. They maintained surveillance files on Dorothy Day and the movement for decades. Why? Because they opposed war and advocated for social justice. During the Vietnam War, some Catholic workers engaged in civil disobedience against the draft. This made them FBI targets. The Bureau infiltrated Catholic worker houses, monitored their meetings, and tracked their members. A movement based on feeding the hungry and opposing violence was treated as a national security threat. The files were released decades later. 4 years of secret bombing. And speaking of secret operations that lasted for years, we've mentioned Cambodia multiple times, but it's worth emphasizing. The United States secretly bombed Cambodia for 4 years before Congress found out. From March 1969 to May 1970, the bombing was completely hidden from the American public and most of Congress. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger ordered it. They falsified reports to hide it. Pilots were told to lie in their mission logs. The bombing campaigns were given false coordinates in official records. When it was exposed, it became part of the articles of impeachment considered against Nixon. The secret bombing contributed to his downfall, but only after 4 years and hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs had been dropped. Entire sections of Cambodia were destroyed without Americans knowing it was happening. Classified September 11th Saudi connections. And speaking of information that's still being kept from Americans, 28 pages of the congressional report on September 11th were classified until 2016. When finally released, they detailed possible connections between Saudi government officials and some of the hijackers. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. Some had connections to individuals in the Saudi government. The extent and nature of Saudi government knowledge or involvement remains disputed. But significant information is still classified. Documents remain sealed. Congressional members who've read classified briefings say they paint a different picture than what's publicly known. The U.S. maintains close relations with Saudi Arabia despite these questions. Oil and geopolitical alliances matter more than transparency about who helped fund the worst terrorist attack in American history. Hypnosis in MKUltra. And speaking of MKUltra techniques we haven't covered yet, beyond LSD and drugs, MKUltra experimented with hypnosis as a mind control technique. The CIA wanted to know if they could create Manchurian candidates, assassins who could be programmed through hypnosis and wouldn't remember their actions. They experimented on unwitting subjects, trying to induce hypnotic states and implant suggestions. Some experiments combined hypnosis with drugs. They wanted to create controllable agents who could commit acts without conscious memory. The results are largely classified. What we know suggests it didn't work as envisioned. You can't reliably turn people into programmed assassins through hypnosis. But the CIA spent years and significant resources trying. The full extent of hypnosis experiments remains unknown because 90% of MKUltra files were destroyed. 5% population, 25% prisoners. And speaking of statistics we've mentioned that bear repeating, we mentioned this earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. The United States represents about 5% of the world's population but holds approximately 25% of the world's prisoners, over 2 million people incarcerated. This isn't accidental. It's the result of decades of policy choices. The war on drugs, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, cash bail systems, and private prisons that profit from incarceration. Black Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans. The system disproportionately targets poor communities and communities of color. No other democracy incarcerates people at these rates. We imprison more people than authoritarian regimes. This is by design, not accident. And it continues today. Gulf War syndrome lies. And speaking of conditions veterans faced that the government denied, after the 1991 Gulf War, thousands of veterans reported chronic illnesses. Fatigue, muscle pain, cognitive problems, headaches. They called it Gulf War syndrome. The Pentagon denied it existed for years. Veterans Affairs claimed symptoms were psychological. The Department of Defense said there was no evidence of a physical cause. Veterans were told it was stress or imagination. Eventually, studies confirmed Gulf War syndrome was real. Veterans had been exposed to chemical weapons, pesticides, depleted uranium, oil fire smoke, and experimental vaccines. Multiple toxic exposures caused real, measurable illness. The government finally acknowledged it in the late 1990s, but only after years of veterans being dismissed and denied benefits. Many died before receiving acknowledgement or care. John Denver's FBI file. And speaking of unlikely surveillance targets, John Denver, singer of Take Me Home, Country Roads, and Rocky Mountain High, had an FBI file. Why would the FBI monitor John Denver? Because he opposed nuclear power and supported environmental causes. In the 1970s and 1980s, Denver spoke out against nuclear weapons and advocated for renewable energy. He testified before Congress about environmental issues. This made him an FBI surveillance target. The file documented his activities, associations, and public statements. It's not extensive compared to activists, but the fact that it exists shows how broadly the FBI defined threats. A folk singer advocating for clean energy was considered worth monitoring. The file was released through FOIA requests after his death in 1997. No official apology for slavery. And speaking of things America has never done, the United States government has never officially apologized for slavery. Congress has passed resolutions expressing regret. Some states have apologized, but no formal official government apology has been issued. In 2008, the House passed a resolution apologizing for slavery and Jim Crow. The Senate passed a similar resolution in 2009. But these were non-binding resolutions, not official government policy. No president has issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. No comprehensive acknowledgement of slavery's role in building American wealth. No official recognition of the ongoing effects of that institution. Other countries have apologized for historical injustices. America, built partly on 246 years of slavery, hasn't. Whistleblowers paid the price. And speaking of accountability that never came, here's the final truth. Most of what you've heard tonight only came to light because whistleblowers risked everything. Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers and faced espionage charges. Edward Snowden revealed NSA surveillance and lives in exile. Chelsea Manning exposed war crimes and spent years in prison. Frank Olson questioned MKUltra and ended up dead. Gary Webb exposed CIA cocaine trafficking and was professionally destroyed. Jeffrey Sterling went to prison for allegedly leaking information about Iran operations. These programs were designed to remain secret forever. They only became public because individuals decided truth mattered more than their safety, careers, or freedom. Most whistleblowers faced prosecution, not protection. They're called traitors, not heroes. And the systems they exposed often continue in modified forms. That's how we learned 101 dark facts about government operations. Someone broke the rules to tell us the truth. Conclusion. And that brings us to the end of our journey through the shadows of American history. 101 facts. 101 moments when the government decided that ethics were optional and accountability was for other people. From Tuskegee to Wuhan. From MKUltra to mass incarceration, from poisoned alcohol to poisoned information. The most unsettling part isn't that these things happened. It's that most of them only stopped because someone broke the rules to expose them. And some of them never really stopped at all. They just got better at hiding. But here's the thing, knowledge is power. Even uncomfortable knowledge. Especially uncomfortable knowledge. The first step toward preventing future abuses is remembering past ones. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be grateful that at least you live in an era where these secrets eventually come out. Even if it takes 50 years, even if the people responsible never face consequences. And remember, the government that did all these things is the same government that promises it's learned its lesson. Sleep tight.